A history of the modern world is in large part a history of Europe, and the history of Europe is determined by the demographic distribution of its population. European peoples have a highly variable IQ. This means that the standard deviation is large, which means that European peoples sample a representatively larger subset of the intelligence spectrum than most other ethnicities. And this means that the average may be higher in Eastern Europe or lower in Sub-Saharan Africa, but the relative averages of the populations really, for the dynamic of power within the societies, aren't as important as the standard deviation. So Europe is characterized by a high standard deviation. This means that power tends to highly concentrate in a static system. If intelligence is the ability to solve problems, and people consider their material welfare to be a problem, which most do, the acquisition of material welfare is the guiding principle of economic activity for all history. So if the European people consider a problem to be the acquisition of material resources, one can infer that the higher the intelligence, the more wealth one is likely to acquire. And this is supported by data comparing the socioeconomic status and the intelligence, the recorded intelligence by intelligence tests. Now, of course, intelligence tests are not perfect, but they do measure something. If it's not intelligence itself, it's some derivative thereof, because it is cognitive function. It's measuring some sort of cognitive function. So whatever it is it's measuring, it's correlated highly with economic performance. So power tends to concentrate in a static system, especially when there's a high standard deviation of IQ. This is the case in Europe, and so during technologically static periods, which there has been no technologically static period, but when things are moving more slowly over the course of human lifetimes as opposed to decades or years, then the higher intelligence population will be able to get a hold of all the wealth because they can acquire the means of production. But capitalism tends to, as wealth increases, close the gap between the upper and lower, because capitalism is a variable system. The creation of wealth happens not from the creation of currency, but from the creation of material goods. Wealth can be defined as matter reshaped in a way that is pleasing to Homo sapien. That's wealth for us. And the only way to create wealth is by investing some individual's time into reshaping some aspect of reality. Well, when technology is relatively static, and the means of production are relatively static, then it becomes essentially a game of who can acquire the most power, and the intelligent are good at this game. Capitalism, on the other hand, is driven forward by the unrestricted growth of different attempts. Different economic agents, will attempt as many ways as there are individuals of acquiring wealth. And so, therefore, as a chaotic evolutionary system, it will move much more rapidly. Progress moves much more rapidly in capitalist systems. So this means that that's a net negative to the high IQ spectrum of specifically European power, because historically European power has been highly concentrated in the upper echelon. And so this was the case until around the 1500s, and then Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, capitalism became unleashed to some extent, and we sprung forward until the point where the creation of currency undermined capitalism. Okay. But you can look in a lot of ways as government being the narrative of a seeking control over new wealth creation. You can intellectual property, patents, the creation of mining rights, and the ownership of public land and controlling real estate tax, business regulations, the Federal Drug Administration to regulate which new patents, which new drugs are allowed, and the FDA specifically is very effective in cutting down on new drugs, on new effective drugs, because the process to get through the patenting takes so long that your patents have expired, or the process to get through the approval of the FDA is so long that your patents will have expired by the time you're allowed to go to market, and so it's not productive for companies to invest in new pharmaceuticals if they know that there will be extensive testing done. So that's the narrative of the past 500 years. Government reaching for new ways to control the creation of wealth, because government, of course, represents the upper percent of the IQ spectrum. And in general, people tend to look after their own interests. So if it is the most intelligent running the country, then they will tend to look after their own interest. And I don't think this is a surprise. I mean, look at things like the bailout. It didn't go from the high IQ population to the low IQ population. It went from high IQ to high IQ. And the same is true in the creation of currency. Gold is really the universal currency. It has the concentration of value in gold due to its scarcity is such that you don't need to. It's highly portable and sufficiently divisible. Gold and silver supplement each other in these ways. They're indestructible, impossible to counterfeit. I mean, you can attempt to counterfeit, but there are always ways of detecting real gold. But eventually people want security, and so banks say, we will house your gold for you and issue you a certificate that represents a claim on the gold in our vaults. So you give us the gold, we give you the paper that you can give to someone else, and they can come in, use the paper, and take out gold. Well, eventually, as a currency, as something that you exchange for the value it has towards purchasing other things, these paper slips began to replace gold in circulation. And then bankers had the idea of the fractional reserve system, in which they issue more paper than they have gold, because they figure, well, not everyone's going to come in and take their gold out all at once. And there's not really an inherent wrong in this, because the wealth is really just the product of human time. And if people have an abundance of paper slips that they're giving to each other and persuading each other into creating new wealth, then the entire economy does grow, and fractional reserve banking seems to be justified. But, I mean, there is a certain level of dishonesty in it, whether or not it's effective. But anyway, the reserve requirements are set by government, and gradually the reserve requirements have been lowered to the point where today we're not on a gold standard. Central banks, when they appeared, they had a high incentive to reduce the reserve requirement, because that meant that they could print more money, and that money could be used to pay for government programs. A central bank is essentially a blank check for government to do what it will. And if you look at the history of the United States, that's obviously the case. The growth of government as a percentage of GDP was negligible until the early 20th century with the creation of the Federal Reserve, after which government as a percentage of GDP has more than I mean, it's 10 times what it was. So central banks undermine the currency because as they continue to print more money and they continue to lower this, I mean, it's already a non-existent reserve requirement for gold, essentially. So as they continue to increase the abundance of paper money, they inflate the money supply and decrease the value of each individual dollar. And of course, as we saw earlier with the bankers and the slips representing the gold claims, just having the belief that these dollars represent real value will persuade populations into engaging in wealth production and will increase the economy. The problem is that when inflation constantly deflates the value of the currency, citizens have no reason to trust it. So when this, essentially we're on a bubble of the dollar. We're on a bubble of paper currency. When people stop perceiving that it has a dependable value, then they will return to the old systems of currency, the real universal systems of currency, gold and silver. And right now, central banks are buying gold. Real wealth is again being concentrated into the hands of the upper 1% of the IQ spectrum. So the last 500 years has been the narrative of the upper 1% of intelligent Europeans catching up with capitalism and subverting it, trying to control means of production. And that you can see how using things like Keynesian economics, which operates under an ignorance of currency creation and what is the role of currency as opposed to money, as opposed to wealth, it's not studied in Keynesian economics. Keynesian economics only examines the behavior of populations. And of course, as long as populations believe that these slips have value, then they will create wealth. But this is all riding on the assumption that we're going to be able to take these paper dollars as real money indefinitely, which I think it's becoming clear that we're not. And so when hyperinflation hits and people want to get rid of their dollars for assets that have real value, like gold and silver, I mean, people don't invest in other commodities in times of crisis because corn is not storable, iron is too heavy, gold and silver are portable. I mean, they are the perfect currency. If you want a medium of exchange and you don't have paper dollars, gold and silver are the only options, the only realistic options. So people will be buying them. And the central banks know this, and they are now buying gold, as well as the wealthy private bankers from around the world, the Rothschilds and their legacy from the 1800s on. The bankers who control this system, who control the checkbook of government, are themselves buying gold. Look at who owns gold. Look at who owns the real commodities. Wealth itself is concentrated, or the potential for wealth creation is concentrated more highly now than it ever has been. And just due to this monetary illusion. So the strategy, the political strategy behind this has been wait for capitalism to increase economic growth. And as more firms are operating, the cost of goods go down and the price of labor goes up because, of course, these multiple firms are competing for the same population for labor. So the more firms, the more competition there is for your employment, and they want the highest quality workers, and they're willing to pay more. Competition drives up prices, and of course, as there's these greater number of firms producing more abundant products, this decreases the price. It's basic economics. So they wait for the capitalist mechanisms to increase growth, to increase the standard of living, and then they legislate it after the fact. I mean, by the time that child labor laws were implemented, by the time that the work hours and the safety requirements were established, the free market had already determined those variables. I mean, you can't just legislate a minimum wage of $50. That wouldn't mean anything. It would not mean a thing. People wouldn't be getting real wealth, they'd only be getting currency. Wealth is the goods that are produced. And this is the misconception about businesses as taking value from their employees. I mean, the employee creates wealth, and that wealth, it's not from anywhere. Wealth doesn't need to be taken from anyone else. It's brought into existence by our application of time to reshape our material environment in a way that we enjoy. So one man getting richer does not mean that anyone else gets poorer. In fact, when more wealth is created, the distribution gets more and more narrow. But we have these tendencies towards egalitarianism, and it's been really pushed into us by public education. From a very early age, even the question of variable IQ between ethnicity is just dismissed as racist. When it's I mean, you could consider it racist, but then what's your definition of racist? Racist seems just like a slanderous term for the most part. The idea that the variables of IQ differ between different phenotypic distinctions isn't a radical notion. It's one that's testable, and the data that we have backs that hypothesis. So things like that, and then the belief that the underclasses are disproportionately of one minority or another. That must be because there are systematic biases against particular races in the system, and that we must correct these inequalities in capitalism itself. Well, inequality is part of nature. Inequality is part of capitalism. I mean, not all actors are the same. Only by believing that all actors are intrinsically the same would you come to the conclusion that we ought to all acquire the same amount of wealth. But, I mean, taking away the capitalist mechanism in order to provide equality is nonsense, because it's capitalism itself which generates equality. By increasing wealth overall, the gap of who has and who has not decreases. Whenever you decrease capitalism, whenever you decrease growth, then you allow for a static system. When there's less growth, the system is more static, and the high IQ have an advantage because their innate advantage gives them the ability to acquire more resources. And this egalitarianism is just a blanket of obfuscation to the obvious facts of our demographic. The people who control most of this system don't want people aware of the demographic distributions because it reveals the necessary history. European history couldn't have gone any other way. There's a large standard deviation of IQ. Power concentrates highly in a static system along the lines of IQ. Capitalism is a system which defeats this intrinsic inequality in IQ by producing new methodologies for acquiring wealth, so as a consequence, if the high IQ are looking out for their best interest, they must defeat capitalism itself, and that's been the narrative of the last 200 years, definitely. So that's there's no way that European history, assuming basic axioms of human behavior. Assuming that people want to look out for their best interest, European history couldn't have gone another way. The high IQ had to try and defeat capitalism. And in order to do that, they had to obfuscate the real nature of capitalism, and they had to use junk sociology like Marxism or junk economics like Keynesianism to justify policies which are to the disinterest, to the detriment of the general population.